The perpetual motion machine was never meant to work, it only needed to sell. And sell it did. In the spring of 1823, London's financial district watched with hungry eyes as shares in the Perpetual Energy Company traded hands faster than railway stocks, faster than East India bonds, faster than anything the exchange had ever seen. Investors weren't buying machinery, they were buying the future itself, wrapped in brass gears and wrapped promises. The finest industrial minds in Britain, men who had built fortunes on coal and steam, lined up to exchange their mines and manufactories for paper certificates guaranteeing ownership of infinity. The facade was flawless. Elijah Finch stood before London's elite in a rented hall on Threadneedle Street, beside a contraption of spinning wheels, counterweights, and gleaming mechanisms that seemed to move without purpose, without fuel, without steam, without end. He spoke with the confidence of genius. "Gentlemen, what you witness is not magic. It is simply physics that Newton never imagined." The demonstration ran for 6 hours. 6 hours of perpetual motion, while Finch explained how magnetic repulsion, gravitational paradoxes, and the elegant exploitation of atmospheric pressure had finally solved mankind's oldest puzzle. But inside this gleaming facade, inside the labyrinth of brass and precision engineering, lay a secret. A massive spring, wound tight as a crossbow, hidden beneath false panels and mathematical misdirection. It could run the machine for 12 hours before exhaustion. Long enough for any demonstration. Long enough for doubt to die. The timing was perfect, devastatingly, intentionally perfect. Britain's industrial revolution had reached an impasse. Coal was expensive. The mines were running deeper, more dangerous, less profitable. Steam engines devoured fuel faster than the mines could produce it. And every factory owner, every mill baron, every man who had built wealth on the back of combustion understood one brutal truth: whoever controlled the next energy source would control the century. Finch understood this too. Not because he was a businessman, he had failed at that repeatedly, but because he was desperate. The Royal Society had rejected his papers. The academic establishment had mocked his theories. He had genius but no credentials, innovation but no recognition. The perpetual motion machine wasn't his first invention, but it was his last chance. If he could make it appear to work, just long enough to secure funding for refinement, he could finish his real research. The investor's money would buy him time to discover what he genuinely believed existed, a principle of physics that science had overlooked. He wasn't lying. He was optimizing the truth. The problem spiraled faster than anyone anticipated. Within 3 weeks, the Perpetual Energy Company had absorbed controlling interests in 12 coal mines, 7 textile mills, and the Barrington Iron Works, Britain's third-largest foundry. Investors weren't paying in pounds sterling. They were paying in infrastructure, trading the old world for the new, convinced that coal and steam were about to become as obsolete as the water wheel. Then Dr. Edmund Arkwright published his treatise. 78 pages of mathematical proof, delivered to the Royal Society and reprinted in every scientific journal in Europe. The title alone was a declaration of war, on the thermodynamic impossibility of perpetual motion and the criminal gullibility of the investing classes. The machine, Arkwright demonstrated with ruthless precision, violated the fundamental conservation of energy. It was impossible. Not unlikely. Not improbable. Impossible. Physics didn't care about investor confidence or industrial necessity. The laws of thermodynamics were not subject to market forces. Finch responded the only way he could, by making the machine more complex. If critics claimed hidden power sources, he'd build glass panels to reveal the mechanisms. If they questioned magnetic systems, he'd add redundant displays showing every component in motion. Each modification bought him another week, another demonstration, another wave of investment. The machine grew larger, more intricate, more convincing. And absolutely no closer to actually working. The first sign of collapse came from an unexpected direction. Not from the Royal Society. Not from Dr. Arkwright's mathematics. From a 16-year-old apprentice machinist named Thomas Wickham, who had helped construct the demonstration model and recognized the spring mechanism for what it was. Wickham went to the newspapers. The story hit London like a chemical fire, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. The Times published Wickham's testimony on its front page, complete with detailed mechanical drawings showing how the spring could be concealed and wound. Finch called it slander, the desperate lies of a dismissed employee. But the damage was done. Doubt, once introduced into a speculative market, spreads faster than confidence ever could. Investors began demanding private demonstrations. Extended demonstrations. Independent inspections by neutral engineers. Finch accommodated every request because he had no choice. Each performance required more preparation, more misdirection, more energy to maintain the illusion. He stopped sleeping. His hair turned white in 6 weeks. The machine had become his prison. But the worst pressure came from inside the company itself. The coal barons who had traded their mines for shares weren't just investors, they were hostages. Lord Pemberton, who had exchanged controlling interest in 3 Welsh collieries, cornered Finch after a shareholder meeting. The conversation was brief. "We need production, Finch. Demonstrations are meaningless. We need engines in factories. We need our investments to become real." Finch promised timelines. 6 months for prototypes. 12 months for mass production. He sounded confident because desperation can mimic certainty. Inside, he knew the truth. There was no path from demonstration to production because there was no technology to produce. The spring could power a show. It couldn't power a factory. The entire venture was built on the premise that somewhere in those 6 months, actual science would catch up to his promises. It never did. Dr. Arkwright, sensing blood in the water, escalated his campaign. He published open letters challenging Finch to specific tests, running the machine continuously for 48 hours under independent observation, or opening the mechanism for complete disassembly and inspection. Finch deflected. Scientific scrutiny, he argued, would expose proprietary mechanisms to theft. Industrial espionage was rampant. The French, the Americans, they were all waiting to steal Britain's advantage. The irony was perfect. Finch was protecting a secret that didn't exist from competitors who couldn't steal it. Meanwhile, the financial infection spread. Other inventors, inspired by Finch's success, began promoting their own perpetual motion schemes. The etherical dynamo. The gravitational cascade engine. The magnetic resonance wheel. London's financial markets transformed into a carnival of impossible physics, each new venture promising greater impossibilities than the last. Credibility became irrelevant. If Finch could raise millions, why couldn't they? The Bank of England watched with growing alarm. Capital was flowing out of productive industry and into speculative fantasy. Real factories were being traded for hypothetical ones. The coal industry, backbone of British power, was fracturing as miners and investors both awaited a revolution that would never come. Finch made his fatal mistake in August. Desperate to prove legitimacy, he announced a public demonstration at the Crystal Palace, 6 months ahead of his promised timeline. The machine would run for 72 hours straight, powering a working factory floor of looms and presses. Tickets sold out in hours. Every newspaper in Europe sent correspondents. It would be the definitive proof. Or the definitive execution. Finch spent 3 months building a machine 3 times larger than any previous model, with a spring mechanism powerful enough to run for the promised duration. The engineering was extraordinary, a masterpiece of misdirection. But springs have limits. Physics has limits. And Finch had just promised to exceed both in front of 5,000 witnesses. The night before the demonstration, sitting alone in the Crystal Palace with his magnificent fraud, Finch understood what he had become. Not a scientist chasing discovery. Not even a con man seeking wealth. Just a desperate man who had convinced himself that belief could overpower reality if enough people shared it. He was wrong. Reality doesn't negotiate. The demonstration began at dawn. 5,000 spectators filled the Crystal Palace, their breath creating fog in the morning cold. Finch stood beside his machine, 15 feet tall, 50 rotating components, every gear and wool visible through glass panels. It looked like the future rendered in brass and steel. Dr. Arkwright was there too, in the front row, notebook open. The machine started smoothly. For the first 12 hours, it ran exactly as promised, gears turning, counterweights rising and falling, power transmitted through leather belts to operate a small loom. The crowd applauded each hour. Finch explained every component, answered every technical question, maintained the performance flawlessly. Hour 15, the vibrations started. Subtle at first, a slight wobble in the main wheel easily attributed to normal operation. Hour 18, the wobble became a shake. The spring inside was approaching exhaustion, its tension nearly depleted. Finch had calculated 72 hours. He had been optimistic. Hour 20, Dr. Arkwright stood up. He didn't speak loudly, but the crowd fell silent anyway. Mr. Finch, I would like to propose a simple test. Allow me to measure the rotational velocity of your primary gear at regular intervals. If the machine truly requires no power input, the velocity should remain constant indefinitely. It was a trap Finch couldn't refuse. Declining would confirm guilt. Accepting would reveal the spring's decay. He accepted. Arkwright measured. Hour 21, 47 rotations per minute. Hour 22, 44 rotations. Hour 23, 39 rotations. The machine was dying. Slowly, measurably, undeniably dying. The laws of thermodynamics were rendering their verdict in real time, in front of 5,000 witnesses. Finch tried to explain. Atmospheric variations. Temperature differentials. External friction. But his voice had lost its confidence, and confidence was all he'd ever had. The crowd wasn't hearing explanations. They were watching their investments evaporate. At hour 26, Arkwright made his move. He approached the machine with a pry bar. Gentlemen, if Mr. Finch's mechanism is genuine, he should have no objection to independent verification of its internal components. Security intervened, but too late. In the struggle, a glass panel shattered. And there, visible through the broken crystal, wrapped in felt to muffle sound, sat the spring. Massive. Industrial. Obviously wound by human hands, obviously depleting with each rotation, obviously the source of every ounce of power the machine had ever produced. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then pandemonium. Investors rushed the stage, demanding answers, demanding refunds, demanding blood. The police formed a barrier around Finch, but not to protect him, to prevent murder. Lord Pemberton, the coal baron who had traded 3 mines for worthless paper, stood at the front of the crowd, his face purple with rage. "You've destroyed us all," he screamed. "Every mine, every factory we gave you, they're gone. Tied up in legal contracts with a bankrupt fraud." Finch wanted to explain that he'd believed, that he'd been so close to real discovery, that given time he could have made it legitimate. But mobs don't wait for explanations. And the market had already delivered its judgment faster than any court. By evening, the Perpetual Energy Company's shares were worthless. By midnight, every associated enterprise was collapsing. The coal mines and factories that had been transferred into the company's control sat in legal limbo, ownership disputed, operations halted, workers unpaid. Britain's industrial infrastructure, which had taken generations to build, was paralyzed by paperwork and panic. The financial contagion spread outward. Every other perpetual motion scheme, every speculative energy venture, every investment built on hope rather than physics, they all collapsed simultaneously. The London Stock Exchange suspended trading. Banks that had loaned against perpetual motion shares faced insolvency. What had begun as one man's desperate fraud had metastasized into a systemic crisis. And then the workers rioted. The Luddites, who had spent decades fearing machines would replace them, saw their chance. If the new technology was fake, if the future was fraud, then the machines themselves were the enemy. Factories burned across the Midlands. Not because perpetual motion had failed, because the lie of progress itself had been exposed. Finch was arrested at his lodging house 2 days later. The charges were fraud, criminal conspiracy, and incitement to riot. But the government needed more than a criminal, they needed a symbol, a scapegoat, a warning to anyone else who might confuse speculation with science. They made an example that would echo through history. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Finch's defense argued that he had genuinely believed in his invention, that he had been pursuing legitimate science, that the investors had been willing participants in speculative risk. The prosecution argued that belief was irrelevant when backed by lies, that good intentions didn't excuse systemic fraud, that thousands of workers were unemployed because one man had valued his ego over truth. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts. But Finch never made it to sentencing. On the night before the verdict was to be formally read, a mob broke into Newgate prison. They claimed to be factory workers whose livelihoods had been destroyed. They claimed to be investors who had lost everything. The truth was probably simpler: they were angry, desperate, and needed someone to blame. They found Finch in his cell. What happened next was reported in every newspaper in Europe, a cautionary tale rendered in violence. The authorities classified it as death during attempted escape. Everyone understood the euphemism. The aftermath was surgical and ruthless. Parliament passed the Industrial Securities Act, requiring physical demonstrations of any technology before public investment. The Royal Society established a certification board to verify scientific claims before they could be marketed. The Bank of England imposed strict capital requirements on speculative ventures. The message was clear: belief without evidence was now illegal. The industrial titans who had traded their mines and factories spent years in court, fighting to reclaim assets that had technically been transferred to a now-defunct company. Some succeeded. Many didn't. Lord Pemberton never recovered his Welsh collieries. They were eventually sold at auction to pay the company's debts. He died 6 years later, bankrupt and bitter, still insisting he had been right to believe in progress. Dr. Arkwright was vindicated, celebrated, and ultimately forgotten. His mathematical proofs became footnotes in physics textbooks, his name mentioned only in academic circles. Heroes of prevention never inspire parades. But the real legacy was darker and more subtle. British investors, burned by impossible physics, became pathologically cautious. When genuine innovations emerged, early electrical generators, chemical batteries, combustion refinements, they found skepticism instead of capital. The Industrial Revolution didn't stop, but it slowed, wobbled, lost momentum at the exact moment when American and German competitors were accelerating. The perpetual motion crisis didn't just destroy one company. It destroyed British confidence in innovation itself. The nation that had pioneered industrial technology became a nation that questioned it. Risk became synonymous with fraud. Genius became indistinguishable from con artistry. The empire still looked vast on the map, still controlled the oceans, still extracted resources from every continent. But the engine of innovation, the invisible force that had made Britain dominant, had been damaged in ways that spreadsheets couldn't measure. Finch had promised free energy. What he delivered was expensive doubt. And in the end, the machine kept its promise after all. It ran perpetually, not as a source of power, but as a warning. In every investor's mind, in every engineer's caution, in every moment when innovation was questioned before it was tested, Finch's machine kept spinning. A perpetual reminder that the difference between genius and fraud is simply whether the laws of physics agree. The greatest perpetual motion machine ever built wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. And it's still running today, wherever belief confronts mathematics and someone has to choose which one to trust. It wasn't a tragedy. It was just thermodynamics. And thermodynamics always wins.